1, 2, 3. If I could tell the things that I've been shown, I'd tell of mountains I've seen, the giants I have known. I've walked with them, so what they could see, saw all that I needed, could be found in thee. 'Cause on giant shoulders, the whole world seems a different place to me. On those mighty shoulders, I once saw, and how they learned to see. Yes, on those giant shoulders, I know all that I am called to be. 2, 1, and welcome and good evening to the Book Distillery. We are the blue-collar scholars discussing books that matter, joined tonight by a very special guest, Professor Josh Hordern from Oxford. Joshua Hordern is the Associate Professor of Christian Ethics in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Harris Manchester College, Oxford. Research interests: Christian and religious ethics, Christian political theory, healthcare, conscience, loyalty, covenant, the role of affections in ethics, Islamic political thought. This is Josh's education. He read classics at Oxford, then a postgraduate work in theology at Oxford, a doctorate in Edinburgh, postdoctoral research at Wolfson College, Cambridge, associate director of the Kirby Lang Institute for Christian Ethics, lecturer at Cambridge Faculty of Divinity, and an elected local authority councillor for Bury St Edmunds. He was in Oxford since 2012. Professor Hordern now supervises postgraduate students in the field of Christian ethics and teaches undergraduate students on courses in philosophy and theology and Oriental studies. Amazingly, I met Josh in a moment of divine providence in a playground in Cornwall, sitting there with our children playing at a playground, and I struck up a conversation. And it was literally the highlight of our holiday, really meeting Josh and his beautiful wife, Claire, and the two gorgeous children. Is it Peter and Luke?
Yeah, Luke, the doctor theologian, and Peter the Rock. That's right. I had a lot of fun playing with your little ones, and it was a lovely beginning to our friendship because there's lots of fun hospitality and good coffee and conversation there. So
yeah, it's just far too brief. That was the thing about it all. But it was lovely. Felt the smile of heaven. So everybody, let's give Josh a big round of applause. You're very, very welcome to the Book Distillery.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Henry, and everyone else.
Indeed. So joining us tonight, of course, are not the brothers Grimm, the brothers Andy and Jeff, Ben from Bath, Richard from up my way, and a very special guest, of course, in some ways, is Harry, back from, how many months of marriage, Harry? Is that 4?
Got to a 3-month anniversary now.
Brilliant.
Oh.
We are so pleased for you and Hannah, and, it's lovely to see you back. And he told me beforehand that it's been a brilliant 3 months, so thank God for that. Okay, guys, tonight we're discussing chapter 15 primarily, and then we'll move on to a chapter that Josh wrote in another book, which is to do with political theology. So if listeners have not read, and this will be coming up on your screens if you're watching on YouTube, the summary of chapter 15, which is called the Europeanisation of Europe, is effectively a bridging chapter between the world of Columbanus and the world of Robert Schumann. It's our link. Such things under discussion, the very broad headings: 380 to 1949, European exceptionalism; 1400 to 2016, British exceptionalism; 800 to 1920, the long march of European reintegration; and finally, a Christian perspective. We will be taking this tonight in 7 sections in the first half, which we'll be discussing, which is something that Josh and I hammered out yesterday in a phone conversation. But before we do that, blue-collar scholars, would any of you like to make any comments about chapter 15, just to loosen the wheels?
Well, for me, the theme was like the Europe's sense of mission. If Europe has an identity, finding a purpose for the concept of Europe. For me, that was the theme of the chapter. I thought that was really interesting in the context of the world today, moving into blocks like the East Asian bloc and India and South America and Africa and so on, Europe being a bloc with it. And I was wondering, in terms of a division of labour among the nations, among the blocs of nations, where we fit in. I mean, that was sort of where I was going with it. It's just putting your narrative, which I love this chapter. I thought it was brilliantly done, as Jeff said, and putting that in the context of now, beyond just looking at Europe, looking outside Europe. If Europe is a we, then who are we?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks for that. Any other broad comments, things that struck you guys on the first reading?
Yeah, I mean, I think, culture keeps coming up as a theme throughout the whole book, really, doesn't it? But this chapter, I think I quite liked because, it sort of steps back a little bit outside just the narrative of Schumann or Columban and kind of takes a bit of a wider view. I like the little quote near the beginning. I think it's T.S. Eliot, that you can't make a tree, you have to plant it and nurture it. And in the same way, you can't really make a culture as such, but you have to plant and nurture it as well. I just thought that was quite a nice kind of start to the chapter, really, that it's sort of from there that you get kind of a question and a discussion around, where do we fit into it, and how do we come into the sort of overall European narrative? Is Europe over? Is it not? What's next? I think it really kind of sparks some really good kind of deep thoughts and discussions for me. I read it kind of in conjunction with the Epilogue as well, which we're not talking about tonight. But just a little sneak preview for listeners is that the Epilogue kind of takes some of those themes and explores it in a bit more detail as well. The others are chuckling there because I read the Epilogue mistakenly thinking that we were discussing it tonight. So for once, I'm ahead in my homework rather than behind. So that's a nice change.
For those listening at home, we'll be doing that, the Epilogue, and with Dr. Jonathan Chaplin. So stand by for that. Anybody else want to chip in there on just general?
On that whole thing of culture and being influenced by the roots and the nurturing process of time and what influences have on a culture and a nation and a block of nations. It's interesting because in many ways we can't choose the circumstances of our nation. And this whole book has been looking right away from the Romans and the Mayans and people in ancient history throughout history, how those have influenced the modern times, and how England is really interesting and Britain is interesting because some of us were influenced by the Romans physically, practically, by the Romans being in these islands, and others weren't. And across Europe, these ancient parts of history have affected us in ways that we can't change, and just have to accept and acknowledge that there are things in our culture that come from the Romans, from other civilizations, and from Christianity. And one of the core themes through the book is how has Christianity influenced Europe as a whole and each individual nation specifically.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I feel bad because I haven't actually read the chapter, but an observation that often strikes me when I'm talking to political theorists. Obviously, the question of exceptionalism is very big. So in maths, there is essentially a theorem that if you have a space that has more dimensions than points you are comparing, then no matter how you compare them, they are in any comparison, there are going to be exceptional points. And in fact, if you think about the way in which we measure countries and the metrics that we use, by definition, there's far more metrics for countries than there are countries. So it seems that exceptionalism is then a fact for every country. I think the interesting question is, what makes this, or what is the exception for this country? What is the thing that makes this country special?
But we're not talking about the usness of a country. We're talking about Europe, aren't we?
I'm happy with saying that continents are exceptional too.
Yeah. There's a bit of both in this chapter, actually. There's a bit on
this chapter
both. It is, after all, written in English for English.
And it was quite, I was just like a kid in a sweet shop with this. I just couldn't believe all these lovely things I was finding, and how, and like Andy is saying, you don't realize how things made you who you were. And when you find them out, it's really thrilling, I think. Who knew about the charters? I didn't. And the military orders, and quite how revolutionary they were in Europe. for good and ill.
Talking about European exceptionalism, I think the thing that just captivated me again is just sitting with the narrative of Europe, and also just looking forwards. I think the line that struck me most in the whole chapter was just that thinking of Europe conquering, but its inability to conquer itself, and from all this thought leadership and philosophical striving forward and Christian underpinnings, we end up with this war of 100 million dead, and suddenly the reins are handed over. And it was just that sitting with that fact of loss, really. Not loss, but just it's just from that pivotal moment, suddenly you go from all this influence to it costs this extreme amount, and you're kind of in the back seat. And looking at America, and you mentioned it in the chapter, as kind of the spiritual passing on of the baton, I suppose, in one sense. And then looking at just even the industrial kind of rise of the East a lot more at the moment.
Just pick up on that pathos that you talk about, that sadness in the exhaustion. I feel that. And you sort of see it in the collapse of let's say, the League of Delos, in the collapse of Arthur's Round Table. Like, human beings with all their aspirations fail, you know what I mean? And that sort of, and you can kind of really see that and feel that as a Christian. You can look, because we see, that Christ will fulfill all of those things, but it nevertheless, it certainly fills me with a sense of deep sadness. I've just finished reading a book about the Italians, written by an Italian, and a great sense of loss because of what the writer called the terrible memory of greatness that the Italians always had, and how that marked them all the way through history, and how different they are from the English because of that, and geographical things, Andy, that we had no control. Anyway, that's the
Italians. They need counselling from the Egyptians, really. But I was thinking your book begins with Augustine and the collapse of the Roman Empire, Augustine of Hippo, and that's one of your starting points, isn't it, Henry? And Augustine's reflection that perhaps the whole point of the empire for its 1200 years, whatever, up to that point in the West, was as a vehicle of the kingdom of God, and it's ultimately dispensable. And that's the big shocking thought behind City of God, isn't it? That the empire is a vehicle and it's dispensable. It's a means to an end, and the end is the kingdom. And so you could say, are we at an Augustine of Hippo moment with Europe? Has Europe served its purpose as a mission station to the globe? And is it time for Europe to dissolve or whatever, But the truth is, as we've looked at, as you've hinted many times, you keep referring to Eastern Europe, that you've only done half the story. Rome didn't end, of course, for another 1,000 years. So perhaps it's possible for Europe to find some sort of, what's the word? A coda, an epilogue, a thing to do after it's done its main job. Because I tend to think Africa's bound to be important because of the growth of the kingdom there in the last 100 years. And of course, East Asia now. So if influence follows the kingdom because Christ is king, then perhaps Europe's had its day.
I'll just throw in one bridging thought there, which I found very interesting, was the theme of world-weariness on page 434, which I think is connects with this sense of sort of twilight, perhaps, for sense of European mission, was a phrase or term used earlier. But for Augustine as well, it's a really important theme, world-weariness. Number of Augustinian scholars, Sarah Stewart Croker in Geneva, Carol Harrison here in Oxford, have been thinking about world-weariness and groaning, and that being a key thing that the church is doing at the moment. And it's the sense that, cynicism, or the idea that a mission which was tethered to a civilizational purpose has, as it were, disappointed us, perhaps because we've disappointed ourselves, and so being weary of the world as being disappointed or weary with ourselves, and therefore longing, desiring the kingdom of God, I think, as has been said. So I think there's a number of Augustinian themes. We may come back to that in a moment. I could see Augustine in many of the dimensions of this chapter.
Thanks, Josh. Should we move on to that first point that we had about, because this is probably will touch Augustine, how European Christianity found political expression. We had some talk last week about Christianus gens, the holy race of Christians, Gregory the Seventh, the Crusades, the tension between the royal and episcopal supremacy. Josh, do you want to just talk about that for us? Because this is something that you picked up in the chapter that interested you.
Yeah, so this is coming in page 414, and it seemed to me an interesting point at which we could delve a bit more deeply into a number of themes of the chapter about a sense of the church's place in European civilization. And I appreciate the chapter's a fairly rapid gallop, is your word, is rapid pass through many centuries of history because of the nature of the argument you're making here. And I suppose one thing I just want to raise for us is how we think about this notion of gens. Race is a slightly unhappy translation in some ways. I mean, populace or people is a sort of similar kind of term, but we're really thinking about the nations in some sense here. This is the gens term, and so I had a look back in my Gregory in order to prepare for today, and it struck me that what's going on here. So Gregory VII, also known as Hildebrand, is making a case, of course, for papal supremacy and for the kind of role that the church can have in governing a landmass, in governing multiple territories which share something like a similar faith. It's very clear to my mind, what he means by this is very similar to the Augustinian two cities way of structuring political thought. But with the emphasis here that with the temporal power having passed to the hands of the church, how to give a much fuller theological accounting for the role of the ecclesial hierarchy in directing temporal affairs. So when we talk about a holy gens, a people, we're talking, I think, very much in that Augustinian context, over against, of course, those who are not part of the city of God. And that plays to some extent into absolutely your narrative about the Paganorum Fines, the lands of the pagans, which is there, right there. But Gregory is a complicated character. I mean, he's not sort of sitting four square behind political rulers as if they are the kind of the people who are going to be dispensing all justice and wisdom. I mean, he's a great fan of the Benedictines, who also come up in this chapter here. So I just wanted to raise that for service, and I'll pause now. But I mean, I think there's an interesting contrast we might want to draw with the way that political theology was actually emerging, not on the European continent, but more on the landmass which we share at that time. I'll pause there.
Anyone want to come back on that? Any comments? Richard, perhaps, as well? I know you had something.
Well, one thing that's come up I was just going back to the letter to Diognetus to find a Greek word that's translated as race for Christians. I haven't found it yet, but
I mean, it's most likely to be ethnos. Not for certain, of course. You have to locate it. But I think the letter to Diognetus is a very interesting. If we want to take, as it were, 2 points of reference around Augustine, we might see the letter to Diognetus as a kind of proto-Augustinianism, where we have those very strong contrasts in paragraphs or chapters 5, 6, and 7 between the way that the people of God function among those who they live among, and those who they live among. But then, of course, the soul language, which is a kind of leitmotif, I think, of this book, isn't it? It's the soul of Europe, is the church. But the soul in the letter to Diognetus is in some kind of conflictual relationship with the flesh. It's not a kind of happy form meets matter relationship. It's not like that. Yeah. It's there's much greater sense of conflict and antipathy. So if you've got a kind of proto-Augustinianism there in the letter to Diognetus, we get something more like a sort of highly developed notion of Augustinianism in Gregory VII, with this idea of a plenitude of power coming our way in European political thought. So those would be two points of reference around Augustine. I'll forgive me. You have to interrupt if I'm going on for too long, Henry. Or
No, you're fine.
I remembered what I was going to say on that because I run a forum for patristics, Joshua, and one thing that's come up through a lot of our patristic study, that one of the new admins I've brought in actually is a scholar in Africa. He's a an American living in Kenya as a missionary, but he's really alerted me to the extent to which we've tied the early church to the empire much too closely. So we're tending to look only at Greek and then Latin texts. And the extent to which the kingdom, the church, rapidly spread through many nations in many languages. The closest is Syriac, to the patristic record, but there was a lot going on in Asia. The resurrection of the early history of the church in Asia. So what I'm saying is that the kingdom was never completely identified with the empire that became Europe. There was always a lot more going on. So European exceptionalism was always based on the schism, the schismatic nature of the church, especially, of course, the Great Schism in 1054. So the empire splits and the church splits down very predictable lines, Greek and Latin, and they stop talking to each other. And each side develops its own sense of exceptionalism. So, we end up with Kiev and then Moscow as the third Rome. And we end up with the West thinking of itself as immensely privileged, the descendants of the Latin Empire. So, yeah, it's just an interesting factor that Christianity has never been aligned with any one empire.
I think it's very, very valuable. And of course, Augustine would very much agree and would encourage us to pursue exactly the lines of inquiry you've just been encouraging us along. I remember when I was 18 or 19 being in Fort Kochi in Kerala, and of course we've got there the emergence of the Indian church there with Thomas, isn't it? Who's reputed at least to have been there. So. I strongly agree with that, and I think there are really wonderful movements out there. And Henry was telling me something about the Lausanne conference that he's just been engaged in, where Western Christians can be properly decentered from their sense of being, as it were, the sole context of disclosure of the kingdom of God.
Exactly, because if we put all our eggs in one basket and the basket collapses, then
and it can lead to all kinds of idolatry. And I think one of the things I would be delighted to discover more about and to learn more about in the course of the next 30 years as I work in political theology is the kinds of political theology, if it even wants to be called that, which would emerge from all sorts of contexts which are relatively untouched, or can be, as it were, seen in counterpoint to the ways that we've developed political theology in this context. But that's not to say that in God's providence there hadn't been very valuable political concepts and ideas which have been developed in the settings which we're more familiar with. But what is God doing now, and what has God been doing throughout history in ways that haven't been attended to as well as they might have been by Western theologians?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in one of the answers, I suppose, to my question from earlier would be that the answer for Europe is to be rescued by the wider church. I mean, in the sense that as the Church of India becomes more indigenous, stops thinking like a colonial church and starts thinking like an Indian church, and that is happening. Some quite exciting thinking has been going on in Indian theology in the last few decades. I'm always amazed how slowly the colonial inheritance stops. The last time I was in India, I was offended just how Western it still was. I was in a church that was a total clone of Holy Trinity Brompton, and down to the lectern, and I just thought, oh gosh, and the way people are dressing, I thought this is the opposite of mission, that incarnational mission. But and this was local Indians, dressing up to imitate Westerners. But I think there is a shift going on, and the current crisis in American evangelicalism is helping in a way, because instead of us going from, Europe's falling to bits, but we can look to America, now the whole evangelical world globally is thinking, okay, America's falling to bits. So actually the center is no longer in the West. And we're looking, and I think the rise of the Chinese church and the rise of the Indian church, and also the growing voices in South America and Africa, they potentially can rescue Europe from its shipwreck.
Well, I mean, that may or may not be. It'd be hard to. God's hand and providence is inscrutable, and so it may or may not be the case that it works out like that. But I think to be resolutely open to the gifts that God might give for all parts of the church must be the calling of God's people. I think the thing which the chapter particularly suggested to me was something a little closer to home, though, which is, the chapter presents a kind of a narrative of the emergence of what it is to be European, but it particularly draws this counterpoint with British exceptionalism, and I think I was quite interested to sort of track down that line a bit further, by just observing that the role of Gregory VII in the development of Christendom, there are other voices which are critical and critical, let's say, of the way that European Christendom was developing. And one figure who is less known, but I think very, very valuable to reflect on, is someone called the Norman Anonymous, whose name obviously we don't know. We just called him the Anonymous, and he was making the case, of course, for political reasons, but also deeply theological ones, against a kind of ecclesial or papal supremacy in the way that we govern temporal affairs, and actually in favour of a royal supremacy. Now you can see. And he's doing that perhaps somewhere between northern France and somewhere in, other side of the country from the lakes, somewhere in Yorkshire possibly. He's making a case which will of course become then a leitmotif of specifically English political thought to do with the lay supremacy in ecclesial and political affairs. So even, as it were, within that period, there were disputant voices. So we get, in terms of our conversation we've just been having about the variety of political theologies or political theories emergent from Christianity worldwide, it's actually quite instructive to look at the way there were very interesting disputes going on in the sort of 12th century or 11th century, to see the variety of ways that political thought can then develop at that period. So we look from Norman Anonymous through to figures like Wycliffe, who pops up in this chapter alongside Huss and one or two others, and then to figures who don't appear, people like Cranmer, who could also be seen in a strange kind of way as obviously very politically influential, but also as a kind of proto-political thinker in a way, through the way that the prayer book develops for those who are Anglicans think about such things. So I think that sort of, I was very interested by the way the chapter led us into those kinds of dimensions of British and European relationships over the centuries.
I love the way that Henry has a couple of times, and again in this chapter, flagged up the peripherality of Britain and Russia and the equivalence of those two in Schumann's thinking, and in many other departments. Henry's constantly flagged up the idea that Europe can just about hold itself together, but they're not quite sure about Russia, not quite sure about the British Isles.
I mean, Schumann knew it. He said from the first look he saw on his friend Ernie Bevan's face when he mentioned the project, he knew. And he said, they won't come in, or if they did come in, they'll only be in for 50 years, which proved pretty prophetic.
I think that's crucial for the reason why many people reluctantly supported the Remain cause was for geopolitical reasons, even though they might not have had much sympathy with the European institutions, but to sustain a strong European Union against a threatening Russia. Yeah. So it holds true, and we could talk about Franco English relations or Franco-British relations at some point today, and which are, of course, very much in the news again at the moment. But all these old power blocks keep on grinding away one against each other, and the question is the question for us perhaps is what kinds of Christian resources are there to contribute to public life.
I was amused and intrigued by Trump's observation a couple of years ago that he said, well, I won't bother doing his accent, but he basically said, the EU is a German show. That's how he put it, basically. He said, that's basically the Germans did, getting everyone to go along with their agenda, and I thought, well, if you take that very simplistic view, which he does, then I thought, well, then we're back to Germany versus Russia, which just takes us back a long way.
Yeah, and I think the underlying themes of this chapter are, yes, they are geopolitical in a way, but they're much more subtly theological. And the Butterfield's quote, which was wonderful to read. I hadn't come across it before.
Beautiful, isn't it? He's beautiful, man.
And I thought that was very stimulating because it provides a slightly different angle on the language of mission, if we're thinking it in missional ways, and perhaps goes back in a way to what you were pushing us towards, Richard, which is to think about how to renew a sense of mission for a Europe which sees itself as highly cosmopolitan in the main, at least at elite levels, with its vision of modern internationalism, but without the doctrinal basis and sort of cultural heft of medieval Christendom. What will, as it were, the new or emerging Europe, yes, in former Eastern Bloc countries, but also in our own country, look like in 100 years' time, with widespread and continual immigration patterns, with the growth of more kinds of Christianity? Where should we look for renewal? And who are the big conversation partners? Should we be looking for conversation between secularism and Christianity? Or, as I think, much deeper conversation and engagement between forms of Islamic and Christian political thought, which I think is where the frontier really lies.
This is something I've come up with myself, and I thought it might be controversial. I don't know, but it's in the Epilogue. But that's exactly where I go. I say that
we haven't got to that bit yet.
No, that's okay. I'm interested to know what Jonathan's going to make of it, because if, like, in 20, 30 years' time, the Islamic political mass becomes such as they're finding political expression, who better to help and partner it with the other people of the book? The Christians, perhaps, could be the ones to find, and I could just see, for the temporal common good, that, for helping them negotiate beneficial forms of political expression, not as in a paternalistic way, but in a kind of a partnering way in a demographically declining Europe. And it's in the book, so if anyone listening wants to, I can always send them the chapter and they can put a comment on that before the second edition comes out.
Yeah, I suppose I think that there's a long-term responsibility for Christians to engage in a deeply neighbourly, sympathetic, thoughtful conversation with the varieties of forms of Islam which there are. So a few years ago, a colleague and I here in Oxford set out a project which we called New Conversations in Islamic Political Thought, in order to attempt just that kind of encounter. And it was very educational for me, I've got to say, and we'll see where it goes, if it goes somewhere in the future. But I think it's hard to think in those 50, 100-year cycles, but I do think that those who are following, as it were, the drift of your chapter should do so, because I think that's where you're pointing us. That's why I found it very helpful, the kind of voices you were bringing back, and Eliot, of course, as well, and his very potent analysis, which I think, I don't know, was it Harry mentioning it earlier about the tree? I can't remember who was mentioning the Eliot quote earlier, but I think that's that.
Yeah.
One thing is also to listen to what the rest of the world's saying about us. I've been really encouraged looking at legal and constitutional law, constitutionalism and legal structures, human rights law around the world. There's some papers I've been doing on Kant and the use of Kant, and there's been a real revival of, the Kantian school's been revived in the last 25 years massively in applying to legal issues with more confidence again. But one thing that I've become aware of is that the ripples from what Europe has achieved are continuing to spread around the world. If you look at the growth of liberal democracy around the world over the last 100 years, it doesn't show a decline of that aspect of European influence, but a continuous growth. It's actually encouraging. Look at Africa in the last 30 years, South America, and there's a tendency globally toward what we would call quite a European forged model politically and legally. The growth of human rights courts. Eastern Europe the Western Europe is busy wringing its hands and soul searching and wondering what it's all about. Eastern Europe is still catching up with Western Europe, desperate to create the legal structures and the court systems that they see in the West. And there's been really encouraging growth. And of course, as a lot of the legal theorists have shown, it is like a Trojan horse politically, because once you start importing these liberal political structures, it starts affecting business and government. So I thought that was encouraging. And also looking at the growth in Latin America, there's been a growth of human rights law, which clearly comes from originally European models, but it's coming in a post-colonial way. And I think it's exciting. So what I'm saying is maybe the ripples of what Europe has achieved haven't finished washing through the nations. I liked what you said, Joshua, in your paper that we were encouraged to read for this. You said the concept of secular politics signals a Christian belief that all citizens are fellow creatures of God. And that key core idea, it also links to a lot of things Henry says, that if the gospel is true, then it's naturally secularizable because it will say things that just have grip, that have leverage, that apply to human beings wherever, with or without faith.
Yes, I'd certainly, I certainly saw the connections. I confess I hadn't reread the chapter for 5 years before I read it again yesterday, and I saw some nice connections between what Henry's saying and what I was trying to put across. And it's very kind of you to bring that quote out, because I did notice that one yesterday, and I thought quite a lot more about secularity. But let me just say one thing, which is I'm reluctant to elide, and I don't think you were fully eliding, but forgive me if I'm overreading, the kind of the spread of liberal democratic institutions, mores, structures with, as it were, the fruit of the gospel. And there are certain fruits, of course, of liberal democracies which might not be the ones that emerge from the kind of tree that we were discussing earlier. No, who was, I think, who was referring to the tree earlier?
No, it was Jeff.
No, it was Jeff. Sorry, Jeff, because you were drawing us back, weren't you, to Eliot's tree? And I suppose one of the tasks of judgment in which belongs to the church, and probably characterizes the church, is to make a judgment of the different kinds of ways that liberal democratic forms have developed and emerged. And so what's interesting perhaps in what you said, Richard, is to discern how it is that these institutions or patterns of thoughts go under sort of certain transmogrifications as they are developed in different settings. So what will be distinctive about various forms of Latin American versions of these thought forms and practices. And then just going back to Islam, there is a big set of conversations going on, people like Andrew March in the United States, Mohammed Fadl in Canada, about in what ways any kind of Islam is able to engage with liberal democracy in such a way as to possibly produce properly Islamic versions of liberal democracy, or to participate in other kinds of liberal democracy in Western countries in ways which are, as it were, in accord with Islam. So I think there's lots of versions of that conversation going on, as you say. And those are, in a way, yes, ripples of the kind of energy of European civilization still going on around the world.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lied to them, because I was just saying that they've emerged from a dialogue of the European mind with Christianity and the Jewish tradition.
Exactly.
And they are accidental, they're not essential to the gospel, but they're good fruits. They do stabilize nations, they do reduce war.
Yeah, and certainly someone like Jonathan Chapman, who you'll be talking to in due course, would, you can ask him how closely he associates the particular ways that liberal democracy has developed in Western Europe with let's say, certain kinds of Protestantism. And especially, it's been past conversations with him, I wouldn't want to put words in his mouth. There's been talk of the pneumatology, that's the kind of democratization of the kingdom of the spirit, of course, pays its way through to a recognition of the worth of the individual and the kind of rights talk, which of course has then come under criticism from various fronts in Christian political theology. But something else you were saying about mobility made me think about another part of the chapter, which I really enjoyed for slightly more parochial reasons, which is the mobility not just of political thought forms, but of saints. And I particularly enjoyed the way that St. Edmund was popping up in Egypt. A number of wonderful nuggets in the book. I don't know if others enjoyed that, but it was a very nice.
I thought that was great. Thomas à Becket in, wherever it is, Cairo or wherever. It was really funny. I liked your point a moment ago, Josh, about discern. Well, I think you used the phrase judging between different things, but discernment. I'm reminded of, I think it's in Ezekiel, where there's a prophecy about, that the Lord's people will discern between the holy and profane, between the unclean and the clean. I wonder if maybe those dividing lines don't look the way that we might expect them to, that actually sometimes our partners in developing culture might be people that we wouldn't expect, or that actually, perhaps the hand of providence moves in a way that we might not predict. I don't have an example of that, but I'm just wondering if there's sort of, a way that we might be able to discern between, something that's beneficial for the, I think Henry used the phrase temporal common good, which I quite liked. Is there a way that we can work out what's actually going to be supporting that and what isn't? And if I'm just a question to you, really, if that's okay, is how might you go about sort of assessing that, or sort of in our own kind of practical day-to-day lives, what might we be able to do in sort of making sure that we're supporting structures or practices that advance the common good, and also coming against those things that actually might be destructive or at least distracting from what might be for the common good. Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, it does to me. I think it's a very interesting question. So classically we talk about this in terms of prudence and some kind of practical wisdom. I think the word judging is interesting because it is. So Jesus calls us to judge for ourselves. So often his other words are quoted, "Judge not, lest you be judged," and we'll come back to that. But I think to judge for ourselves is a crucial vocation for Christians, and we shouldn't make that too kind of internal or pietistic or something like that. It's about trying to make the kinds of judgments which, yes, the prophets were thinking about, as you were saying, about the way that political cultures develop. Now, of course, as soon as one says that, the finger points back to ourselves in the life of the church. And so that's where going back into these medieval and patristic, as Richard was saying, sources of political thought is crucial. Because unless we judge our own thought, as it were, our own the quality of Christian thought first, then we will be ill-equipped, as it were, to be of any use to anybody else. So I think we've got to do that. And a way that we can do that is, as we've already been indicating, is to open ourselves to the judgment of others, those who might have surprising judgments to make of us from sources which we did not expect, and to be ready to offer hospitality and to be open to be corrected. I've spent a lot of time in Aquinas in the last few years, and one of the interesting things which he says is that compassion and fraternal correction are essentially sort of intertwined. And so to be ready to be corrected by one's brothers and sisters around the world is a crucial part of what it is to be in compassionate long-term relationship. So and in terms of the judgment language, there's a lovely book called by my former supervisor, Oliver O'Donovan, The Ways of Judgment, which, as it were, takes that judgment language to the nth, as it were, and takes it through the kinds of sources of political thought which have created our current political dispensation. So I agree with you. That's my way of saying it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. No, because it's something that we talked about in a previous episode, I think, Henry, wasn't it, about, at what point do we engage with the current system, and at what point do we try and work outside it, or try and create something new? I think Schumann didn't accept a role under the occupying force. There's those kinds of questions which I think are quite interesting and thorny, and obviously there's quite extreme examples, but it's something that I think
let's touch that now, because Josh and I talked about that yesterday. We were talking about the monasteries and universities, and we were talking about the people that stepped outside, and we were mentioning, I think, probably Huss, Wycliffe. I did want to mention actually as well, and this almost seems unrelated, but Charlotte Mason. I don't know why she's on my heart at the moment, but my wife went to the Charlotte Mason College, but she was a Victorian educational pioneer, and she stepped outside the system and decided she would be the standard instead. Richard was sort of lamenting when he went to an Indian church and found that they were aping. There was no confidence to be Indian. They had to ape being, they were aping being Western. What a wonderful thing we see in these various saints going through the continent with such incredible confidence that it borders on pugnacity almost, but it's not. It's like a lovely kind of gospel expression. So Josh, you want to talk about this particularly, and I think this is really good. So it's the monasteries, the universities, these artificial communities that became a European catalyst, and those who had to step outside it to kind of I mean, well, we're talking about the ways that institutions bear some we're talking about temporal goods, but also enable people to participate in eternal goods. And where they fail to do so, and people notice that and decide that another course is required. I mean, just going back a moment to Edmund, the abbey in Bury St Edmunds, 11th century, in the town where I used to be a local authority councillor, was an institution which was intended to, of course, give shape and form to the English landscape, to hold the temporal good and the eternal good together. How well, of course, it went on to do that. So a further point in discussion. But it's interesting that figures like Edmund escaped those institutions, became inspirations, as it were, in all sorts of other places. And I suppose monasteries and universities maybe have a similar kind of function in that they are meant to be places where the goods of God's world are coordinated, knowledge and learning and so on, for the benefit of those around them. We had in the chapter very interesting accounts of the way that Oxford and Bologna and other institutions were being developed. But then, of course, you do find these figures like Wycliffe who want to do extraordinary things. Tyndale is another such figure in our tradition who wants to do amazing things because they feel called by God, but end up having a terrible time of it. Wycliffe, of course, famously disinterred, and his bones were they ground up and scattered in some river or something like that, and Tyndale meeting an untimely end elsewhere. So you have these figures who are caught up in political affairs for very good theological reason. And I suppose what I find interesting about them is that they help us to reimagine, at least remember, that when we look at the politics of Europe, we must look at it not with, as it were, the grid or the eye which is offered to us by contemporary political theory, although that has great strength in many respects, but actually with the eye of the scriptures, which is the way that these people thought about politics. And so one of the tasks, I think, of the church is to help the church to imagine the political, to imagine culture in ways which draw us back into scripture, draw us back into often, I think, patristic and medieval thought forms. And when that happens, the institutional cost may be high, as it was for people like Wycliffe, as it was in a way for there are other figures, of course, who went outside the university and did immensely influential things, which we may assess differently, Nietzsche being the obvious example. And then on the other side,
Charlotte Mason and others doing their educational work. So the university, although I sit in a university, I'm very thankful to be here. I think it's great. It's still a tremendous institution for coordinating good and debate and discussion. Isn't the only place where interesting things happen, which I think is perhaps the purpose of the blue collar scholars and the book Distillery. In any case, is it not?
Yeah, nice. I highlighted. Well, with a pencil anyway, I wrote it a little star, and then in capital letters that it's page 419, talking about the all-important freedom of dissent. Which is what I think we're talking about here. That kind of you almost need to know something in order to know that you want to know something different, I guess. That kind of having a base from which to then jump and say, actually, do you know what? I want to think in a different way from this, or I want to explore something in a different way. I quite liked that, and I was amazed that that some of the numbers here. First 150 years of their existence, it's estimated the European universities enrolled 750,000 students. I was like, hold on, is there a wrong zero in there somewhere? But no, actually, that's right, and I'm kind of quite staggered by that, really, in terms of the influence. Not only then, but even right down to today. I mean, we're still quoting and talking about the things and the thoughts that a lot of these people wrote about then. So yeah. Anyway, sorry, just an aside, but.
I want to leave space for the next section. I'll just say that we've talked about the saints and places, the monasteries and universities, how European Christianity found political expression, some of the paradoxes and difficulties faced, some of the tensions. And the tensions run straight down the heart of each man, don't they? Augustine talks about the bellum intestinum, this internal war that we have. So we're not... there's church authority and militarism. Josh perhaps wanted to maybe add some bits to the chapter. I didn't mention Francisco Suarez. So did you want to just add that, Josh?
Well, there's only so much you can put in a chapter, I suppose. But I mean, the complex story of the way that the westward expansion of Christian ambitions, let's say, was met with a variety of criticisms, I suppose, internally. Judgments against the wicked behaviours of many of those who engaged in that, especially, of course, in what we think of as Latin America. And those voices of Suarez, of Vitoria, Las Casas, more famously perhaps these days, are extremely important for the way that Christians found internal resources to reckon with their own abuses.
Yes.
And again, that's an interesting model for us today to draw back on, that these figures known as the Second Scholastic had this resolution that they wouldn't simply, as it were, commit to the imperial ambitions of of those who were their country people, but actually would find resources within their tradition, within Scripture, to provide a way of judgment, as Jeff was bringing to our attention earlier, forms, patterns or manners, processes in which we could judge ourselves. I think that, again, is relevant for our talk of world-weariness with our own civilization.
And the sort of Hebraic prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power and so forth. So, okay, there is, one thing we were going to talk about, but I don't think we should now, is British identity and exceptionalism. Anyone have a one-breath answer, Isla?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we mentioned earlier sort of the Romans and Egyptians even, and their identity and looking back to their ancient history. Greece is another one. But with Britain, we have this idea of this great empire that we once owned, and coming out from under that to a lesser position in world politics is a strange thing, a realization that you're part of something that was great, but are you still great? It's a very interesting, strange reason to think in, and how even as an individual do you think of yourself in that society?
It is. It's a very, very big deal that, how we think about ourselves. And I just refer back to that quote about the Italians, the terrible memory of greatness. Luigi Barzini talked about the Italians and how that's haunted them. And of course, that could probably fester into resentment of some sort, maybe and some people certainly have accused sort of Brexiteers of that. I don't think it need to. I think there could be a new humility that could really bear fruit. And that's kind of one of my hopes, actually, out of our current, post-war condition. So anybody else?
Yeah, that's a good hope. Something that I'm just thinking about is the use of narrative in sort of communication. Like, you could say propaganda, I guess, but like one thing that kind of jumped out for me was page 423, where you're talking about how the Tudors used their Welshness as a mechanism for unification when they took over, I'm just sort of, I don't know, that gripped me somehow, partly because I'm part Welsh, but also just kind of that sort of applicability to lots of different situations as well, that people will say, oh, we're all the same because of this, or everyone else is different because of that, and I guess like that can be used to very, very negative effect. We think of Nazism and so on, or actually there's that kind of positive, bringing people together under a common banner against something evil, perhaps. So I just thought that was a really interesting kind of example of use of some kind of token or collectivism or identity or something to promote some kind of narrative to a bigger end. But
Harry, did you want to add something there?
A general thought about this kind of identity that plagues me is, so you often have, so you think of the emergence of French identity in the time of Napoleon. So all of the countries around them have attacked them in the chaos that's followed from their revolutions, and they've been very weak. And suddenly they say, okay, everyone around us opposes us. We oppose them. That's what it means to be French. And the 100 Years' War for England for Britain as being very much the same thing. Look, down south, there are people who oppose us. What it means to be British is that we go to France and we, unify France under the British monarchy. I do wonder much about how we can create new identities and new ways of bringing together people that aren't about the threat narrative of the next door neighbor country. And I think that developing them is key to creating the right kind of political and national dialogue from a Christian perspective.
Well, I have a question,
Go on, Rich.
Point-stroke question from that part I can throw in here, which is, Henry's talked about the prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power. And you, Joshua, quote the famous Jeremiah passage about praying for the place of your exile in your chapter, the place of captivity. And I was thinking the past masters of managing, having been in power and being in permanent exile, are the Jews. And I was thinking that, so much of the political tradition of Europe is indebted to the dialogue of Gentile and Jew. A book that Jonathan is aware of is Eric Nelson's book, The Hebrew Republic. It's a brilliant retrieval of what was going on with the dialogue between Christian thinkers and rabbis in the 17th century, and how important that was to the development of several elements of modern politics. And I was thinking, the dialogue with Jewish tradition is surely an incredibly helpful lever. It's one of the secrets of Europe, is the Jewish population within Europe. And I was thinking, and of course there's a Jewish population historically in China and in, even India. There are places, but there's certainly a very old one in China and so many other places. So I was just thinking, the dialogue with Judaism is a natural place to go. I was wondering if that is, because I was intrigued that Joshua's been talking about dialogue between European and Islamic ways of thinking. That's interesting, but natural mediators in that would be the Jews, I would have thought. It's just a comment rather than a question, really.
Okay. What I'd like to do really is just to move off my chapter and then segue using Richard's got a barrage of comments. If we can make it last as long as we need, I'm just conscious of everyone's time. I'd like to hear some of these questions, Richard, and you get them together in a way which sort of leads out of where we are.
Well, I've got.
Can I just make sure Harry's question at the end of the previous segment wasn't lost? Do you want to restate it, Harry?
Yeah, okay.
And I'll try and pick it up as we go along. I'm just conscious of wanting to move along a bit.
My question is, I guess, how we can develop identities and national identities, or even supranational national identities, without having threat narratives and without being united in opposition, but for something.
Let's try and circle back to that, because I think it's a really crucial question.
Yeah, it is.
And it's one which I've tried to think about. Anyway, so I'll keep that in mind.
I want to hear what you're going to say about that. Do you need time to
what
think?
makes us us without it being we're not them?
Yeah.
If that's possible, Okay, so I'm in your hands, Henry. Richard, however you want to do this next bit.
Oh, right. Okay, fine. Okay. Richard,
I had some general questions for Joshua. Joshua, Henry sent us, we'd all read chapter 15 for tonight, but he'd also sent us a second text, which was your piece from Jonathan's book. That was, the date on that is 2015. Did you write it around then?
So this was a chapter whose title, European Union Identity and Place, is part of that edited volume by Jonathan Chaplin. I think I actually finished writing it probably, funnily enough, in about summer 2013 or 2014.
So UKIP was really important in the news, yeah.
So it was written in a context where I was trying to assess in my own mind the prospects of the European Union, and trying to read theologically what I observed going on in terms of the ways that certain kinds of national identity seem to be threatened by the ways that a European Union were apparently eliding the possibility of there being a them and an us, the kind of ways that different nations or traditions might pride themselves on certain ways of life which were apparently at least under threat. And of course that's taken many different forms, as we've seen in the last 8 or 9 years, the different kinds of national movements within various European countries that we've all observed. But the answer to the question, Richard, is that it was in the context of around about 2013 to 15. I think I maybe finished in 2014.
Yeah, so that's just when the Tories were getting spooked by, Nigel Farage, essentially, wasn't it, with the backup of a party? And what was your response to Brexit? I just wanted to ask you an open question, because if you wrote that before the event of Brexit and the events since, I know that's a huge question, but what was your first response when the results came out in June 2016?
I'm not sure my own personal politics are actually so relevant. I mean, I think the way that I'd read it theologically is that what was happening and what Brexit was an expression of is of a variety of nation states and people and sections within failing to see themselves represented in the kinds of narrative which were being presented by the European Union, or which they perceived to be represented. And then the threat to certain treasured ways of life or patterns of valuation of aspects of ways of life. Whether I think I talked in the chapter about work and marriage and one or two other things, what we were seeing emerging was a number of different national expressions, each unique in its own way, and that perhaps goes back to the different kinds of exceptionalism we were discussing in the first part, being under pressure. It's hardly a particularly unique insight, I wouldn't have thought, in 2013-14. I think everyone was seeing that. But I was trying to read it theologically and trying to give some accounting of what it is that would allow for enough national identity while allowing for those supranational channels of communication.
Indeed.
First.
This isn't necessarily an intelligent addition, but something that I think is very key in the sort of the theology of that is this concept of the Trinity, that you can have something that's unified without being a group of clones. So the identity of the Son is never destroyed by the fact that he's in union with the Father. The identity of the Spirit is not destroyed by the fact that it's in union with the two of them. And as I understand it, many of those who've been central to the development of the European Union over the decades have absolutely recognised in various kinds of doctrine different kinds of national narrative, different forms of institutional apparatus and legal structures. So the margin of appreciation doctrine, which I referred to, I think, one of the footnotes. I'm not an expert on these things, but I think that's meant to enable a certain amount of diversity, which I think is a point you're making, Harry, between nations. Subsidiarity is meant to do the same. But I think enough key symbolic features of people's lives were felt to be being chipped away at. And I think in the end, this is where the role of affectivity, and maybe this comes back to your question, Richard, the role of affectivity to me is so central to politics. What it is that people feel, and I take feel to be a kind of cognitive word, not a anti-rational, irrational word. What is it that people feel about their lives and feel about the way their good is being represented is so critical to politics. And it's sort of underrated by sort of standard, slightly more detached forms of political theory. That this, I mean, it's the same, people deride personality politics, but I think it's fairly evident that individual personalities capture moods and enable moods to grow and to be directed towards certain political ends. So I suppose post-Brexit, I thought, that is what's happening, is that people are finding ways to express their deep concerns, worries, in ways which are getting traction.
Yeah.
And
I
think, of course, we're now seeing that in a variety of different settings. We could look at cessationist movements as well, Catalonia, Scotland as well in this context.
Well, I like there's an intriguing quote in your piece where you talked about the deep. You gave an example of the apparently trivial but deeply felt issue of weights and measures, which was in the news in 2013, and I thought that was interesting for me because we've been studying British history. Before we got to Henry's book, we were looking at a sort of encyclopedic history of the Isles. And one thing the whole business of weights and measures is a national construction. So really, we've got one artificial construction from 300 years ago, the UK, up against another artificial construction that's newer, the EU. And it's too artificial. In terms of the parameters of your piece of writing, all about home and locality, and having a home and having a place which is yours, neither was particularly well placed, was it? I mean, we're up against a sort of one abstract geographical construction from 300 years ago of nation against a transnational thing, which is newer or perhaps older. So, yeah, I just thought it was, I like that quote.
To follow up on that point, an artificial construction can become my artificial construction or
exactly.
Our artificial construction. Yeah. It's not, and of course, it's the extent to which we love it is, of course, closely associated with that sense of our. So what Roger Scruton would talk about, do these institutions enable us to form a meaningful first-person plural?
Yeah. I think that's vital, yeah.
And so does England enable that? Well, it does for many people, what it is to be English, but for many people, of course, it's the idea that there's a first-person plural, a we, which is English, is deeply antipathetic to their sense of self. Or indeed British or United Kingdom and so on. But yeah, the artificiality of something, it simply means that humans have made it. Now they might have made it for better or worse reasons, but artificial doesn't really qualify it one way or the other there.
Good point. Yeah, because everything non-local is ultimately artificial. Yeah. Good.
Even our governance of the local, this is the whole point that Scruton's making, is artificial. Whether or not we have wind farms off the Jurassic coast, that's our decision. So our love of home and the local is associated with what we do to ourselves. Do we actually destroy that which we love? Do we undercut that which we love, or do we preserve it? Of course, develop it and so on. But that, I think, is the point about home, is we have to develop places which are livable as home, identifiable as a place that we want to treasure and care for, lest we, as it were, cut away the ground under our own feet.
Yeah, I like your idea that, it can be an abstraction, but at least it's my abstraction. I think that's right.
Well, no. I didn't say abstraction. No. I think it's something that it's hard to think of. I don't know if I can think of a place, which is what I was talking about in that chapter, as an abstraction. It's rather the environment I come to love as my own, which is sustained by certain institutional forms. That, I think, is not abstract, but really very concrete.
But I'm saying...
And even the European Union, of course, is not an abstraction. It's a set of definite institutions. But its failure to capture people's affections is, of course, a widely noted point.
Yeah, my point was that we have to work with where people's loyalties lie. And if there are millions of people in Europe who now feel a loyalty to the idea of the EU and being European, I think the euro was a fiasco, not doing the fiscal union, but I think it was poorly planned. But one of the rationales for bringing in the euro was that if people are starting to circulate a shared currency, the ritual of that starts to train them in a new sense of affection. One of my questions was...
how do you think that worked out?
How do I think it's worked out?
Yeah. I mean, that was the idea. Or how do others think it's worked out? I mean, it's that's the purpose of it. But even as, is that the kind of thing Schumann would have thought was a good idea? I've got no idea. It seems. I don't know Schumann's history. Was it part of his package?
They left it open-ended. This ever closer union from the Treaty of Rome is, right. I in some ways I wish maybe he had sat down and put a sort of full stop on at one end of it, and perhaps, sort of predicted Maastricht prophetically and said, don't do that.
Yes.
That'll be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Just keep it as an economic federation, within definite bounds.
Because an ever closer union, this is one of the lovely things about one of the quotes in the chapter that I can't remember where it was, but it's when you go to a European country, it's not hard to feel at home there, in a sense. And I don't know, I can't remember who said it in the chapter, but someone else will. But that kind of union is a distinct kind of thing from a monetary union or a single currency. And it sounds like Schumann might have made different judgments than perhaps his
yes, earlier on, Josh,
his political descendants did.
Earlier on, we quoted Orosius, Augustine's friend, who said something very, very similar. He said, wherever I go, I'm, among the Franks. It's somewhere back in the beginning of the book anyway. But he could have been speaking exactly as we've just spoken now about feeling at home in Belgium or Spain or somewhere.
It was that's right. No European can be a complete exile in any part of Europe. Burke. There we go. Very, very, very sensible person to quote at almost any time. I think the idea, especially for Christians, that you would feel a strong antipathy or something like that to another part of the European continent as a British Christian, it seems to me extremely unwise and totally out of step with a Christian vocation. But the distinction between that, of course, and for many Christians, the specific way that the institutions have developed around the European Union is an important one.
I have a question. It's quite a long question, but I think you'll get where I'm coming from. You said at the outset of your paper that you were going to write at a conceptual level as opposed to legal, historical, economic, constitutional specifics, but you also pointed to a critique of liberalism as totalizing, and you depicted Scruton's suspicion of the abstractions of liberalism, which can often mask group interests and power dynamics. You know, the idea of like the American Constitution, where all men are free, but not really. One of my questions for you as a theorist was, how can any conceptual approach avoid falling into that trap of a disingenuous universality? Isn't the logic of a conservative approach to start from the concrete, the local, the temporal, and then how do you talk about that? So what can a conservative language sound like? What does Scruton's way of thinking, Scruton's version of conservatism, how can you talk that way without falling into the trap of universal abstract language which attempts to dictate to everyone?
Okay, I'm just going to feed the question back and make sure I've got it. In a sense, whether or not that chapter is a perfect or imperfect argument is neither here nor there.
No.
So I may have...
No, it's a general question for you.
Yeah, but I think exactly, so the question's the interesting thing. So the question, as I've got it, is that broadly speaking, conservative ways of conceiving of politics tend to avoid abstractions. They tend to think about particulars and institutions and what it is that can serve the good in a particular set of arrangements in order to serve the common good. Though the common good language might not be uppermost. The question, I suppose, is what kind of conceptual thought is fit to a conservative practice?
Thank you. That's what I'm asking.
And I think that is a good question. Part of the answer, annoyingly, is having a sufficient conceptual awareness to see conceptual threats to conservative practice.
Yeah.
And so by observing as both, funnily enough, Scruton and Habermas in their way do, and Habermas is a fellow traveller, it seems to me, and a very interesting figure to engage with. He's not exactly the kind of, shouldn't be thought of as an enemy or something like that. It's nothing like that, but rather a very interesting figure who is engaged actively with theology. But the challenge there is to, for a conservative looking at someone like Habermas, is to observe where the tendency of the thought may lead, which is in many ways, especially in respect of religion, away from the concrete and the doctrinal to something much more fungible, so which can be turned into a lingua franca, I suppose. And that's where I think the conservative gets off the boat there and says, no, thank you. In order to have a robust and meaningful discourse about what will make for the good of my place, I need to actively be engaged in specific doctrinal debates. And by doctrinal, I mean something not far off from Rawls's comprehensive doctrines, but I suppose with sort of theological content assumed. That is, when we think about the secular, as we were discussing earlier, we're looking at multiple forms of doctrinal commitment in more or less polite combat with each other for the soul of institutions, for the future of a people or a country. And a conservative is interested, I think, in those kind of micro level of conversations about particular places. So they're interested in how this doctrinal disagreement, which may seem abstract and conceptual, will impact the concrete. And I think that's my way of answering the question, is that a conservative has to be sufficiently conceptually astute to notice how what the first person plural loves, what we, if we have a we, love, is going to be damaged by certain kinds of abstract thought form.
Thank you. That was a very Burkean answer.
May I play devil's advocate for a moment?
Whichever advocate you like. Yeah.
So, from what you've said, you could maybe categorize as Celsus's critiques of Christianity as Burkean. So, Celsus says, "Look, here are some of the I'm a pagan. The world is pagan. Here are some of the parables of Jesus. Look at these. They don't uphold our pagan values. They're going to destroy our great pagan civilization." How how could we weigh Celsus's comments and reject them if we also take the same kind of argumentation in the modern day?
Sure. So I won't pretend to the knowledge of a particular debate which you were just describing, but I'll talk in general terms. It's a general question, I think, is about when you have a conversation ongoing between a deposit of pagan civilization and as it were Christian arrivistes who are seeking to shift that deposit. How does conservatism work there? Something like that. Well, I've tried to argue elsewhere that conservatism is not simply about conserving things; it's about judgment.
Brilliant.
And that seems to me, and in that sense, judgment can be radical. If there is something which is threatening the good development of a civilization, that's the threat language, I suppose, as well, then conservatives are going to conserve what's good at the cost of what they see to be the drag anchor on progress, ironically. And I think that's the conversation to be had there. But the manner in which they do it is crucial. And here it's very important not to elide conservative and Christian. Very important. Very important. Because, of course, many of the great battles will be between those who would never think of themselves as conservatives, but are radical Christians, over against intransigent status quo interests who are seeking to prevent progress. So I think neither left nor right should ever capture, of course, Christian identity. Sure. Especially in the context of, the debate on the altar of victory or something like that, which is a sort of classic of late 4th century Christian disputes. Should we cleave to and preserve the altars of the pagan gods, for they're the ones who are going to save our civilization, or should we not? Or should we prefer only the Christian? So. And this is not a kind of recherche debate. This is about how specific cultures, say in sub-Saharan Africa, develop, or in whichever parts of the globe we look at. How will Christianity and various forms of traditional religion and worship be in conversation with each other in respectful long-term dialogue? These are non-trivial lessons that the history of Western Christendom can offer. Not lessons necessarily of our good conduct, but perhaps of how not to do things, as well as how to do things, which circles back to where we began, funnily enough. Yeah. That's
a very, very good answer. I asked that question feeling like I was a jerk for asking it, because it was, I think, overly hard for something that was unprepared.
It's a very interesting question.
Your response, I liked. So if conservatism is about judgment, what are the metrics by which a conservative should... I'm sorry if I'm just derailing everything. What are the metrics through which a conservative should judge? Should they be tradition, or...
Yeah, they can't... It depends on the tradition. I mean, this is the trouble about any kind of sort of monoglot version of conservatism. This is where we need some kind of gift of glossolalia, I suppose. Conservatives have to speak in many tongues and be astute to all kinds of good cultural deposits, attentive to them, be very wary about overturning that which may appear to be good, be cautious in development. But if they see something which by some standard, and that's the question you're asking, I know, they determine not to be good, they have to make that judgment. Now, of course, the classic standard which Christian political thought has looked to, and here we go back to a very important conversation Richard was raising earlier, which of course is the vital long-term conversation between Christianity and Judaism, between Christians and Jews, absolutely vital. But the standard by which Christians have traditionally turned is law, and Deuteronomy in particular.
Great.
what kind of civilizational gift does this great gift to the world of the law, which God gave and which is given to the Jewish people and through them to the world, what kind of wisdom can we discern from there? And of course, there have been various figures of late, people like Jonathan Burnside and others who you may have come across, who sort of really work through in their views the way that this great deposit can be, as it were, reappropriated for our current legal problems. This, I think, is another key Christian task. I'll stop there as I'm rambling on again. But judge not that you be not judged. If you judge, you will be judged by what standard? Well, Jesus himself promises that he came not to abolish the law but to fulfill it. And I think this is where we should look for our to be wary of being judged ourselves, but also to judge for ourselves.
I like that. That's good.
I have two more questions, but I can chop it to one if we're two-toned.
Give us your best one first, Richard. Come on.
All right.
Shoot them out, baby.
I'll try and answer more briefly. I'll try and answer more briefly as well.
No, it's brilliant. It's lovely to have you back, Harry, by the way.
Very kind of you. Thank you. It's lovely to be around you all.
That was just such a classic Harry curveball. I loved it. Just relish it. But what about Celsus? So I have a question for you, Joshua. Your theology you sort of give us a sketch of a theology of place in a very brief sketch in your piece. And your theology of place leans ultimately on the eschaton. It's very eschatological at the boundary. But if you suggest that eschatology and ethics are intimately linked, people need to know where they're going in order to go there. So what is your eschatology? How do you more concretely than you can, because you really just gave it as a heading, what eschatological framework is relevant to current politics or to particularly the question of Britain and Europe? How does eschatology play in? What is your conception of the eschaton, and how can you make it relevant? If you're not prepared to talk about your personal views, just how can you sketch ways in which you see eschatology relevant to current politics?
Certainly have to talk about my personal theological views. No trouble with that. I'll go with that, certainly. I think the recovery of the sense of the new heaven and the new earth, which we've benefited from in the last, say, 20 years or so, the benefits, of course, of that prophetic vision of Isaiah, but of course Isaiah speaking out of the expectations of Israel generally, is the kind of the keynote of the eschatology that I think about, and that the expectation of that end, in fact, the already givenness of that end, since then you have been raised with Christ, then shapes our ethic. And the ethic is one which, as it were, think about the energy of the eschaton, the energy of the promise of that eschaton, not, as it were, cutting us loose from the created moral order, but demonstrating to us the inescapable nature of our obligations within it. We are always participative within the created moral order. We are inescapably creatures, and this perhaps goes to the secular point that you were touching on earlier, Richard. And I think the benefits of the eschatology is that it frees us to participate now in the created moral order in ways which are meant to anticipate the return of the King. Now, what does that mean for politics of place? Well, we need to reckon with a couple of things there. The first is our capacity to care for and participate within the created moral order is, for most people, very localized. for most people, very localised. Of course, there are influences that our local activity has on other places, but we have therefore to learn to love the places which we can act in order to anticipate the coming of a new heaven and a new earth. So this gives us a kind of an ecological thrust, which is what Scruton's getting at in his green philosophy, book, which I refer to. But of course, eschatology teaches us not about, I don't know, the new Oxford, the new heavens and the new Oxford, or something like that. That teaches us the new heavens and the new earth. So the concern is global. But the to repeat a cliche, the nature of our loves is local, and therefore our action is predominantly local. So I think that's how I'd start to answer your question. But that local is not the same as ethnocentric, if by ethnocentric we mean particularly focused on anyone who shares an ethnic group. Not at all. Quite the reverse. The expectation of a new heaven and a new earth is the blessing of all the nations and all the tribes and peoples of the world, and therefore any kind of local love which isn't attached to the love of all the nations of the earth is not one which is formed by Christian eschatology. I suppose I'm very persuaded by one of Augustine's sayings, which is that yes, you should seek to do good to all the people you can, but you should start by doing good to those who are closest to you, those who you can see, those who you can engage with. It's not a conflict between one and the other, and that I don't think is just a crass way of saying charity begins at home. It's certainly broader than that, because Augustine is seeing this in a much wider eschatological frame. That as our love is locally formed, then it fans outwards, and especially fans outwards through the church. I hope that helps a bit, Richard.
It's such a wide question.
Yeah, but it's
Jerusalem, Judea, and then the ultimate parts of the earth.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that's not to say that we shouldn't be always thinking about the ends of the earth as we love the places which we care for locally.
Well, so it's like an American who celebrates Thanksgiving. So they have a day for being thankful, and the day for being thankful gives them a time and place to be thankful, which then practices, hopefully, for being thankful throughout the year. But the particular reinforces the general case rather than eliminating it.
Yeah, to be creaturely is to be in a place, is to be bodily. In the end, it's a sort of the affirmation of Augustine against Plotinus and Porphyry and the Neoplatonists. But it doesn't stop there. It can never stop there just to say, my place and no other, because that's to have a far narrower gaze and a far narrower heart than the heart of God and the gaze of God. At the same time, there is a Catholic Church out there which is called to all the different places, Catholic with a small c, all the different places and times. And there's a limit. We are finite in our capacities. Nonetheless, the Psalms call us to pray that our hearts would be enlarged as we run in the way of God's commandments. And the enlargement of the heart is, of course, not just for my neighbour next door, but for my neighbour on another continent.
Wonderful.
Just before, I'm very conscious of Josh's time, particularly. Would you allow Richard one more question, or how are you feeling about this? I don't want to get on the wrong side of Claire.
I think we've probably run our course now. It's 10 to 11, and part of the reason we've run long is I'm probably less trained in podcast etiquette than I should be. So
no, not at all. Not at all.
If I've rambled
This
long.
has been so fascinating.
Josh, really, I will think deeply on some of the things you've said. It's been very, very good.
Well, I'm very grateful for the conversation. I mean, I've really enjoyed conversation with everyone. And Richard, perhaps we can carry on with a further question in some other forum.
I've got your email. Yeah.
Henry, I volunteer to do the timestamps on this one because
Oh, Jeff, you're so kind. Thank you.
See, it's what you said, Joshua, is helping those closest to us.
Joshua, Professor Hordern, Blue Collar Scholars, thank you for a most engaging conversation. Thank you, listeners, for bearing with us over such a long and varied conversation. That was a lot of meat to eat. So there's plenty of opportunity there to just go back and listen again. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Please put a comment in. Please put a question in. We are such a small little group. It means that you will get an answer. So thanks for listening. Thanks, everybody, and happy Christmas. But once again, Joshua, for you and Claire, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been really interesting conversation.
Hope you have a good night's sleep.
Thanks.
Remember also that this journey was part of the research for a book which uses the lives of Columbanus and Schumann
to explore the unlikely arrival, survival, victory and atrophy of European civilization.
Do follow the links below to find out more.
Please let us know what you thought of this episode, what you liked, what you didn't, what was new to you. Just start a conversation below in the comments section. And of course, if you found the content helpful, then we're pretty sure you're going to like this next one suggested here. But also while you're there, don't forget to help us by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.